Now we will hear Dr. Kərməli's lecture, The Analytic Position and the Paradox of Pride and Humility. And at the end, we will have time for discussion. Dr. רוני כרמלי is a clinical psychologist. She is a member of the Tel Aviv Institute of Contemporary Psychoanalysis. She teaches psychotherapy in Levinsky College of Education. Roni's research focuses on the space between philosophy of language and psychoanalytic theory. Roni, please.
Thank you, Hadar. First of all, I'd like to say that I'm really excited to be here and to participate in this very special conference. I will share the screen so you can follow. I think the Hebrew speakers got a chance to get the Hebrew translation. I hope you got it on time. Okay. Okay. So what is humility? How can one be humble? And what is it to be proud? Is there a difference between pride and arrogance? How does all this relate to mental health and to clinical work? These questions came to me reading Akhtar's thought-provoking paper, Humility. I will try and show in this paper that humility is paradoxical, not only that one cannot claim to humility without being extremely arrogant, but also that the mere effort to be humble has in it the wish to be better, to excel. I will link my thoughts to Beyond's paper on arrogance, focusing on the Oedipal myth, which includes the complexity of growth and acceptance of death, not expectance, as well as the limits of language and interpretation. This is a complexity, wait a second, okay. This is a link already made by Beyond's interpretation of the Oedipus myth and has its roots in Sophocles' original tragedy, which is a version of the well-known Greek myth appearing in Homeric verses. Wait. Okay. Etymology. First, let us turn to etymology. I find etymology an extremely useful tool for illuminating the unconscious meaning of words. In this case, Akhtar's paper provides us with the etymology of the word humility. This word originates from the Latin word for earth, humus, which inspires many associations. Perhaps the most prominent one is connected to the mortality of being human, for dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. It is interesting to further investigate the etymology of related words. The word modesty, for instance, is rooted in Proto-Indo-European root med, meaning taking appropriate measures, accurate amount of things, but it also relates to thinking and judging and ruling. In this respect, it seems that the measure of modesty is related to mortality, as insinuated as a punishment in the story of Genesis. When Adam and Eve wanted to know as God knows, they were forced into a more modest position. Beyond writes that when death instinct is strong, benevolent pride may turn into arrogance. Is the relationship between the words humility and modesty similar? Does humility appear when the benevolent and moderate wish to be modest takes an arrogant twist, fed by the death drive? Pride is rooted in the Latin verb prodesse, to be useful, do good, while arrogance originates from the Latin arrogantia, presumption, pride, haughtiness. It is the abstract noun of the verb arrogare, ad plus rogare, meaning towards requesting, to ask, propose, a law, a candidate. The etymology of the word request, rogare, is apparently connected to the Latin reg, reign. This is extremely interesting in context of Bion's paper on arrogance, dealing with a play translated to Latin as Oedipus Rex. The paradox. When thinking of the word humility, one also has in mind the word humiliation. If humility is accepting one's own value as finite, humiliation is pointing at this trait in others and involves 2% psychology. But is this relationally not inherent to the discussion of such matters? That is, when discussing, for example, when discussing arrogant behaviors of other colleagues, for example. And is this what we do as a byproduct with our patients? Do we humiliate them when we try and cure them? Achter's investigation of importance of humility as a virtue sought by the analyst in his clinical work led me to some persisting thoughts, which I believe are familiar to all of us, both from early on in our careers, as well as coming from our patients. Is our profession not arrogant by definition, seeking to cure or fix patients, allegedly knowing how a human being is to live his mental life? Lacan attempts to dissolve this problem by his term of the analyst as a sujet supposé savoir, making him the one who knows that he only presumably knows, but does not. This is akin to Socrates' solution of knowing that I know nothing, an arrogant position that might have led one to excommunication and the other to be sentenced to death. Well, I'm joking, of course, there were plenty of other reasons. Coming from patients, resentment to this position of the healer was at times called in the history of psychoanalysis resistance. A patient of mine declared at the start of therapy, "I'm a failure. I have no intention of getting better, just to make you feel good and have yet another success." Even if we do not see our profession as educational, as Anna Freud might have thought, when working with children, we cannot shake off the idea of analysis helping the patient's mental growth, health, or well-being. Even the analytic idea of humility seems to be unhumble. The patient must grow out of his omnipotent ideas of himself. He must not be arrogant. He must accept his lack of control over matters in the world. He must be modest, that is, accept the measure of things as they are. It seems that one cannot avoid the paradox of pride when speaking of humility. The phrase, "I am modest," is equivalent to the famous liar's paradox, and as paradoxical. Freud held a positivistic view of psychoanalysis, and as late as 32-33, regarded psychoanalysis to be part of the positivistic scientific project. According to Freud, truth is the criterion both for fulfilling his worldview as well as for fulfilling psychological needs. That is reality principle. Freud rejects the anarchist worldview that claims there is a paradox in his positivistic worldview. And I quote him, "Since the criterion of truth, correspondence with the external world, is absent, it is entirely a matter of indifference what opinions we adopt. All of them are equally true and equally false." In this context, Freud mentions the famous liar's paradox and dismisses the problem it raises as not practical. A person of an epistemological bent might find it tempting to follow the path the sophistries by which the anarchists succeed in enticing such conclusions from science. No doubt we should come upon situations similar to those derived from the familiar paradox of the Cretan who says that all Cretans are liars. But I have neither the desire nor the capacity for going into this more deeply. All I can say is that the anarchist theory sounds wonderfully superior so long as it relates to opinions about abstract things. It breaks down with its first step into practical life. This is Freud. When we turn from epistemological questions to question of morality, such as the question of humility, further complications arise concerning the matter of truth. For the time being, I will ignore the fallacies of the positivistic position brought forth by Russell's paradox, Wittgenstein's rule-following paradox, and Winnicott's idea of an inherent epistemological paradox. Even if we accept the notion of logical truth in epistemology and ontology, the questions remain whether one is speaking of the truth when one speaks of ethics. Akhtar's thought in general, as you probably noticed, including his work about humility, links psychoanalysis to ethical dilemmas. Some philosophers have found ethics to be as objective as scientific causes and statements. For example, Plato's idea of good, Kant's categorical imperative. Some, however, saw the field of ethics as well as of psychoanalysis not only as non-objective, but nonsensical, as they do not express propositions about truth, but merely express feelings. For example, Ayer's emotivism, Popper, and other theorists of logical positivism. We remain with the question whether it is possible to speak of humility and arrogance, dodging an arrogant position. It seems impossible to deal with this subject without seeming to be arrogant. Meltzer mentions that when Bion read his first version of On Arrogance in 1957, and I quote him, "The reading of the paper on arrogance at the Paris Congress struck many people as shocking display of the very hubris Bion was describing. It seems that one cannot avoid the paradox of pride when one speaks of humility. What I mean is that when we investigate the concept of humility or the rejection of arrogance, one communicates always with a hint of pride what he perceives being modest to be. So, we are not inherently arrogant in our work. I will modestly comply to Winnicott's request and try not to resolve this paradox. To leave the paradox as such does not mean that the answer to my previous question is yes, we are arrogant, but that this tension always is at our table as clinicians. Humility in the clinical action. Akhtar highlights 5 issues which the analyst must take into consideration in his clinical practice if he is not to become arrogant and potentially harmful to the patients he treats. Although Akhtar wisely pinpoints some main issues one should not ignore in clinical conduct, it is interesting to note that the paradox which is inherent to the discussion of pride and humility can be detected on the level of these considerations. This might have to do with humility being mostly unconscious, just like arrogance is. I will briefly now demonstrate the complexity arising from these issues Akhtar points out. First one is humility in selecting patients. Akhtar proposes that one should be cautious in selecting patients and be aware of his subjective sensitivities in accepting a patient. However, most of our work with patients is unconscious and unfolds as analysis progresses. If one initially accepts or rejects a patient, it is mostly rooted in unconscious motives. If actor speaks of awe in the religious sphere before God, or the humanistic awe when one stands before nature, in the psychoanalytic sphere, humility is experienced when one is suddenly aware of the work of the unconscious or of unconscious communication. This cannot be anticipated in advance. In fact, the mere recognition of unconscious is a humble position. And I'm aware that right now, actor said that we should first look at the consciousness and only later on unconscious motives, but I still think that unconscious is very central to psychoanalysis. I don't think he will disagree. We have no idea whatsoever who we are right to accept in therapy and who we must decline.
Oh, die Batterie ist fast leer.
The most innocent-looking case may turn out to be a disaster, either to the analyst or to the patient, as the analytic relationship proceeds, and vice versa. The most dramatically hazardous encounter may turn out to be benign or even beneficial to both parties. We must make all attempts to work through difficulties and impasses. It is indeed frustrating that we can never know whether we will be able to succeed and resolve obstacles that we come across. This is not to say that we should accept every case in our clinic. For example, one can foresee the complications of unconscious malignant work, accepting friends and relatives of the analyst or of the patient. I'm turning to the next point, which is daily conduct with patients. Acta calls for regarding the patient to be a full human being capable of moral and, yes, therapeutic reciprocity, and by discarding the view of the patient as infantile and unwanted. He mentions the questions of fee, discounts, and consideration of the patient's life outside the clinic. For example, taking vacations or absences due to the patient's work. Again, it is very difficult, not to say impossible, to discern unconscious transferential processes from conscious needs of the patient as a whole human being. The acts of the analyst and of the analysand in therapy, even when they are just and considerate of the patient, always involves unconscious communication and motives, and are frequently enactments. One cannot avoid making such acts in analysis, for even rigor adherence to the rules of the setting is an act. The act of listening and attitude. Actor speaks of receptivity and creating internal space for someone else without making theoretical assumptions, avoiding expectations from a single theoretical perspective. He mentions Freud's advice to listen with evenly suspended attention, an idea further advanced by Bion's no memory and no desire on part of the analyst. This issue Actor raises is closely linked to the question of interpretation. The analyst blinds himself to memory, desire, and comprehension. In this, he develops his receptivity to the non-logical and even psychotic material coming from the patient. He withholds interpretation. But listening is not non-active. The act of containing is that this is the pebble coming through without waves. Actor spoke about in this previous talk. The act of containing is not total submissiveness. When reverie takes place, the analyst's unconscious material is at work, and what comes may obstruct the process of containment. As an example, I recall a patient of mine experiencing severe psychic pain during the session. Consciously speaking, I felt very close to her and was surprised when she told me she felt I was distancing myself from her experience. It then dawned upon me that I was using reverie as means of escaping from the patient's, from the patient's psychic pain, and using closeness, affinity, and affection as antidotes to the anguish projected into me. I will now focus on the two last aspects of humility Akhtar refers to, language or interpretation, and death. I will attempt to show that not only the paradox is inherent to both, we must accept these paradoxes as such if we wish to find and create potential spaces and transcend the caesura of this paradoxical profession. Moreover, these two last issues are related and intertwined. To some extent, one can link the following ideas I shall shortly present to the other issues that Akhtar mentions as humble clinical conduct. Manner of interpreting. One of the philosophically intriguing puzzles derived from the point Akhtar makes next, that humility must allow different interpretations and therefore calls for some caution in intervening. But how does one interpret if we do not want to fall into the idea that anything goes? Who makes the rules of what interpretation is valid and what is nonsense? Perhaps the most arrogant aspect of our profession is the idea that we can interpret the words of others better than they can. Well, maybe not better, but certainly with a sense of usefulness and doing good, podese, pride. If we are trying to make sense of what the patient is saying to us, one may even call this containing, then we are assuming some ability that the patient does not have. In his paper on arrogance, Bion cautiously criticizes ready-made theoretical interpretations made by Kleinian and Freudian analysts. This is a paper read in a conference in 1957, only 3 years after the end of his analysis with Klein, and when he was still considered to be in Kleinian tradition. Bion parts from Freud's interpretation of Sophocles' play, Oedipus Tyrannos, and he shifts the focus of the play from a sexual crime to the issue of arrogance or of hybris. In particular, the arrogance of knowing what cannot be known and seeking the truth at no matter what cost. But hybris means, among other meanings, wantonness, wanton violence or insolence, lewdness, riotousness, an outrage on a person, violation, grievous assault. Meanings which tie together sexual gratification, murderous gratification of laios, and epistemic gratification. According to Civitarese, and I quote him, Bion tones down the thrust of his brave proposal, as this is only the dawning of his courageous theoretical innovation. Examining the Greek meaning of the word hybris, it becomes clear that this shift of focus from one aspect of the word to another is an accurate description. Moreover, Freud himself was innovative in his interpretation of the play, classically read from the times of Aristotle's Poetics as a play of hybris against the fate destined by the gods. Bion's shift of focus in his account of Sophocles' play, therefore, hints that an interpretation may be a grievous assault on the patient, a violation of the therapeutic contract. Sexual crime is already included in Greek hybris, and to some extent, hybris and incest are not so far apart. The case of the word hybris exemplifies what Wittgenstein calls aspect seeing and aspect blindness. Words of playwrights, of patients, or in any other sphere have many aspects to them. Wittgenstein's metaphorically says linguistic utterances have a face which one can see from many angles and may be blind to some aspects. This idea is closely related to what we do in psychoanalysis. It is to the word of the patient that we pay our evenly suspended attention. It is words that activate our reverie. In this, I do not mean to exclude silences, gestures, yet ineffable moods in between the gaps of language. All of these have aspects the analyst can light up, to use Wittgenstein's term, in a session. To be more accurate, it is reverie and receptivity that light up aspects in the session for the analyst. But what aspect or interpretation is legitimate and what not? For naive positivists or logicists, such as Gottlob Frege, the founder of classical logics, an interpretation can be true or not true. This position not only excludes many human, mental, and lingual activities as nonsensical, for example, psychoanalysis, ethics, aesthetics, etc., but was also found to be faulty in itself. For example, in Russell's paradox in 1902, which I will not go into for lack of time. Elsewhere, I've described the move Wittgenstein makes from Frege's rigorous theory of language, and for lack of time, I will not go into this now, but it will be suffice to quote Wittgenstein's statement that the paradox disappears only if we make a radical break with the idea that language always functions in one way, always serves the same purpose, to convey thoughts, which may be about houses, pains, good and evil, or whatever. That is to say, language can convey many different meanings. Not all are propositions made about truth of matters in the external or internal world. Grammar has many modes, not solely indicative modes of verbs. Wittgenstein uses the word thoughts here in the same manner Frege does, as propositions about matters in the world. But language can convey subjective modes, such as wishing or demanding. Wait. Okay. Beyond states, he was denying the patient the usage for projective identification and failing to contain the patient. This reversal or backfiring of the investigation is very similar to what Beyond does in attacks on linking. Wait a second, I'm just checking that okay, I've missed a page. Sorry. Okay, Beyond describes patients for whom grammatical functions collapse. In its simple form, this material appeared in sessions when the patient's association lacked coherence and consisted of sentences which were remarkably deficient in one or other aspects of grammar of conventional English. Thus, a significant object might be mentioned, but there would be no pronoun or verb, or significant verbal form would appear, such as going skating, but there would be no mention of who was supposed to be doing this and where, and so on, in an apparently inexhaustible number of variations. The establishment of an analytically potent relationship by means of verbal communication thus seemed to be impossible. In this paper on arrogance, he describes how after looking for the culprit, who is responsible for the lack of communication, he realizes, like Oedipus, that the obstacle is himself, who arrogantly tries to coerce the patient into his own modality of communication. And I quote, "What it was that the object could not stand became clear in some sessions, where it appeared that insofar as I, the analyst, was insisting on verbal communication as a method of making the patient's problem explicit, I was felt to be directly attacking the patient's methods of communication. From this, it became clear that when I was identified, from this it became clear that when I was identified with the obstructive force, what I could not stand was the patient's method of communication." Okay. Bion stated he was denying the patient's usage of projective identification and failing to contain the patient. This reversal or backfiring of the investigation is very similar to what he does in attacks on linking. I believe it is crucial for our patients that once the analytic couple is again able to formulate grammatical sentences as interpretations, they usually should not be propositions about truth in the world, but rather take the form of non-indicative sentences. Organized psychosis, such as paranoid one, tries exactly to do this, to gather bits and pieces of primitive experience to propositions about reality in the indicative mode. This is not only Bion, but also Winnicott's huge shift from Freudian positivistic psychoanalysis. For Winnicott asks us to accept the paradox as is, as part of our profession, and not to try to resolve it. Moreover, he perceives meaning as something that is made not by the analyst's interpretation, but by the potential space made in the analytic relationship, in playing or dreaming, such as the Oedipus myth. Bion mentions Frege in 2 successive footnotes in Learning from Experience, and I quote Bion. "The Oedipus myth is the survival of a model designed to match an infant's emotional experience. In the case exhibits a disorder of thought, it will be found that this model was never properly formed. As a result, the Oedipal situation will appear to be imperfectly developed or non-existent. Analysis of such a patient will reveal attempts, if the analysis is progressing, to formulate such a model." And he continues later, "The psychoanalyst must rely on the emotional experience of the analysis to reveal elements that he regards as factors of alpha function. The analyst, therefore, is in the position of one who, thanks to the power of binocular perception and consequent correlation that possession of capacity for conscious and unconscious thoughts confers, is able to form models and abstractions that serve in elucidating the patient's inability to do the same." In these footnotes, Bion also refers to Frege's idea of unsaturated concept and his objection against postulating logical objects. What he infers to is that the Oedipal myth is one possible model for containing the patient's primitive emotional experiences. This model should not be coerced prematurely, but as Winnicott phrases, should evolve in the potential space, a finding of the patient of what is potentially there to be found. I continue to the last point Akhtar makes, which is the longevity of professional career. Akhtar calls for humility of the analyst in the face of his own inevitable death. If Bion links Oedipus's fatal flaw, amartia, of hubris, to the analyst's arrogance in the interpretation and in seeking the truth at whatever cost. The Oedipus myth also brings forth the question of humility in the acceptance of death. This is enacted primarily by Laios, who rejects his son in his arrogant attempt to defeat the fate he was destined to. Following Weber and Ghent, Acta suggests that the trait of humility is related to the longing every human being has for something in the environment to make possible the surrender in the sense of yielding of the false self. Ghent alludes to Winnicottian ideas, which can be compared to the wish to be found and avoid disaster, although it is not only a joy to be hidden, but an absolute necessity for the core self to remain unexploited. In Bion's words, these yieldings and surrender to the other may be seen as the desperate need to be contained by the process of projective identification, primitive emotions seeking to be processed. Acta sees the humble need for surrender as a reactivation of the non-verbal subjective experience of this supine infantile I, as the infant spends much of his first year in this supine posture, looking upwards towards much taller parents. Moreover, in many years to follow, the child still looks up at the tall figures of the parents. But as the child grows, the awe facing the big may collide with Oedipal conflict and result in arrogance. Acta writes, humility is an outgrowth of a combination of the infantile awe of the parents, Oedipal phase, acceptance of generational differences, and latency phase, wonder about the world at large. The acceptance of generational differences brings forth the unescapable truth that as the child grows, the parents age and approach their death. This truth is at times a crucial inhibitor for some patients to allow psychic growth. Part of the Oedipal constellation is the mortality of human beings. To be more accurate, not only castration anxiety is at stake, but the potential death of a parent, the rival, is a shadow hanging over the child's drive to live and flourish. This is another aspect of Oedipal guilt. Most people believe they will outlive their parents. To paraphrase Freud, this is not the fate of us all, but the fate of most of us if nature takes its natural course. The fact of death, as brought forth by death of a parent, also brings into awareness the mortality of the son. We come across many adults dealing with a psychological crisis due to the death of a parent. This is not only due to the loss itself, but also to the understanding that they are next in the line of generations. The Ivan Illich deduction dawns upon them. I am mortal, therefore I will die. So, if the growing child during the Oedipal phase might believe for a moment that he's becoming the totem father himself, by the time of parental death, there may be acceptance of the limits of being human. The understanding that his growing up is murderous was implanted, or should I say projected into, Oedipus. His development will be the death of his father. As much as the next person, he is enacting this, perhaps a little more bluntly. Oedipus is a well-trained analyst who can rehearse what being human means, and he resolves the riddle of the Sphinx, what goes on 4 feet in the morning, 2 feet at noon, and 3 in the evening. But he does not understand neither the order of generations nor the reality of death. The Sphinx riddle is exactly about the Oedipal concept of time, but this is more paradoxical than it might seem. No one can foresee the time of his death. The linearity of Oedipus's answer to the riddle misses the whole point of time and the fact of death. In this respect, there is no clear answer as to when one should stop accepting new patients as Akhtar recommends. Is it at the age of 70, 80, 90, or when one is experiencing a life-threatening health risks? Should have Winnicott quit his clinical practice after suffering his first heart attack? These questions have no true answers. Civitavecchia mentions that the choir on Oedipus Tyrannus recites a verse on Oedipus's hybris, translated in English to arrogance. But in the first line of Oedipus at Colonus, immediately after coming on stage, Oedipus talks of his pride, genainon. In his choice of words, Sophocles demonstrates the transformation that has taken place in Oedipus. Oedipus in Colonus is a story of therapeutic processing made by King Theseus. A similar shift from arrogance to pride is made by Sophocles in different words he uses to describe Oedipus as king. Throughout the play, Oedipus is described by Greek word tyrannus, which means an absolute sovereign, unlimited by law or constitution, not applied to hereditary sovereignties. Only at the end of the play, after truth is revealed, the choir recites the word basileus, meaning a king, chief, an hereditary king. I've tried to show the paradox involved in the concept of humility as a paradox persistent in all aspects of this idea. I have focused on the question of interpretation and on the question of death, using Sophocles' play Oedipus Tyrannus, following beyond on arrogance, Winnicott's idea of paradox, and Wittgenstein's philosophy of language. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronnie. We now open the stage for this discussion. We have time, and we want to hear all of you, what you think, what you feel. Just feel free to comment. This very, very nice lecture, Ronnie.
רוני, אפשר לדבר אנגלית?
כן, רצוי. We have here guests from many countries. It's very...
Okay, I'll try, but I am very bad in English.
She said if you need, I'll translate.
Okay, no, my accent is terrible, but it was not only a nice conference, Ronnie, it was a very deep and very complex, and you deal with the paradoxical thought, what is always very, very interesting. I have a question. I think I have read in Beyond the Lectures or somewhere that there is a link between hubris and death instinct. That hubris is an expression of death instinct. You can tell something about it?
Yes, I think I mentioned that at the beginning of the lecture that Beyond says that pride is made into arrogance because of death instinct. Okay, the death instinct makes pride, which is a benevolent emotion, or into hybris, into arrogance.
Okay, but how it is linked? Death instinct in something
I believe
you know.
What I understand is that I'm sure I'm not, you know, I can say only what I understand here.
That's okay.
I'm not, but what I understand is that the death instinct makes the knowledge minus K.
Yes.
So from pride, you become arrogant about thinking that you know something that you don't know.
Okay.
And the whole complex of links is diverse.
Okay. Okay. Because death instinct is par excellence to cut the links.
Yes, exactly. It's to reverse them.
Mm-hmm.
But it
Thank
could also, I was linking to Giselle's words, and I'm thinking that in Greek tragedies, hubris was always punished by gods, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a way of asking for God's punishment. So maybe this is the link with the death instinct, because it's also a question, a request for punishment in a way, because those who were proud or arrogant or committing hubris, they knew this will bring the wrath of the gods.
It's a good interpretation. Michaela, your name is?
Yes.
Yes.
It's
yes,
a
yes.
very good interpretation. But
Yes.
I think that when you look at the Greek word, when you look up the Greek word,
Mm-hmm.
then you find that hubris is deathly as it is. It doesn't need a punishment to be deathly, because it's not. It turns it turns positive things like positive things that can be positive, like H and L, into minus H and L. Okay, into minus hate and minus love. The sexual act becomes deathly, becomes like incest. So I think that you're making a very good point, and still hubris is a punishment as itself. It doesn't need the gods for that.
I have also a question or a thought.
Somebody wrote about Adam and Eve
Yeah,
right now, yeah.
Isn't hubris is also a play, a challenge that man plays with death?
You mean
if it's
risk?
known that hubris itself is deadly, so it's like a play that a person, a man, plays with fate, with death.
I think it's I think it's not playful, Orna.
Not, it's a challenge.
I think
it's
not playful.
No,
And
it's not playful.
Yes.
It's like gambling. It's like gambling.
I think it's more like a manifestation of deathly wishes,
okay,
than a challenge of death, or you know, trying to play it. I think it's more we all have some, you know, arrogance in us. I believe. Okay. I think it's a manner of manifestation of our death drive, of the place where we cannot think, of the place where we cannot dream or play. Does it make sense, Ona?
Yeah, it makes me think more and more about it.
Okay.
Good. Can I say something about this dilemma? Hello to everyone. I would like to say that I am Greek. So
Nice to have you here.
I'm very glad that you're talking about this. And in my view, as this tragedy was, we had it in school, you know.
We all did. We all did.
Yeah, okay.
You made it to all the countries.
In my opinion, it is like the hero knows in a way unconsciously that he's going to die. So there is an unconscious hidden desire for death. I guess related to the death instinct that you are you were saying before.
Yes. Well, isn't it true about all of us? We all know that we are going to die.
Yeah.
And we're all seeking, or we all have Thanatos in us.
But even though he knows, he goes to, he becomes, he does this ivris. So this is a paradox again.
It's the paradox because, you know, consciously he is defending himself. He says in Oedipus and Colanos that that he's defending. He's not guilty of patricide because it was self-defense. So this is the conscious. I don't see how Sophocles could not have understood unconscious motives. I don't think it's possible that he wrote this without understanding unconscious.
Yeah, I agree. And thank you very much. It was very interesting.
Thank you for coming.
So for me, it's very paradoxical, you see, because the etymology of the words doesn't help me, because
okay.
You see, the pride and the hubris are the same. The pride is to know or to interpret to our patient, and the hubris is to try to know and to try to interpret to our patient. So the life instinct and the death instinct is in the same action. The pride to know, the hubris to know. So how does it help?
I think what you're saying is that paradox is difficult. It's very difficult.
No, I'm asking what's the difference?
Okay.
Between
the two words?
Yes, not the words, between the two actions to try to know the truth.
I must say that I don't think we're trying to know the truth in psychoanalysis. Okay, maybe you're asking about this. I don't think we're trying to know the truth about psychoanalysis. I think what we're trying to do is to help the patient have more linguistic space, more ability to use different modes of grammar, more playfulness, and more inventions such as the Oedipus model. I don't think we're seeking the truth. I think truth, I know that Bion speaks of truth, and I have a problem with his use of truth. I think he's more mixed up in this sense than Winnicott is. Winnicott is saying this is a paradox. I don't know what to do about it. Let's not try and resolve it. Bion does have a notion of truth, and I think it's a saturated concept. Truth by philosophy. And truth is positivistic. Truth has to do with ontology. Truth has to do with positivism. So what I think we're doing is we're playing and we're expanding our potential spaces and the potential space between us and the patient. And okay, so I'm afraid to say more because Adar is a Kleinian, so I'm a bit.
But Kleinians,
I'm on dangerous grounds here.
But maybe you're trying to tell me, that to try to know the truth is hubris. To try to to play with knowing is pride, and it's life instinct.
No,
maybe
we are talking about searching the truth, not knowing, searching.
I think Wittgenstein is not really solving the paradox. He's doing something with the paradox Winnicott could not do. And what he is doing is saying that what we are doing, he's not speaking of psychoanalysis, yes, but I think it's very true about psychoanalysis, that what we are doing makes sense and has meaning, even if it's not objective truth, even if it's something that is another language game that is very different from scientific truth.
I like very much the thought of René Roussillon, the French psychoanalyst, who is speaking a lot about paradox. And he's telling us one of the goals of psychoanalysis, that's to expand our capacity to accept the paradox, with the capacity to think about heterogenic logicals together. And that's very, very hard.
I totally agree. And I think that maybe the Kleinians can agree with me about this, because paradox has to do with paranoid, with a schizoparanoid position.
Mm-hmm. But in this manner, Kleinians have
hello, Kleinian.
Kleinians have an answer to I believe, to Yoav's question, because Ronnie gave us in cognitive development, his paper on cognitive development, 3 facts of life, which are kind of truth. And the 3 facts of life are unarrogant. They are of modesty and of depressive position. Mm-hmm. Standing and seeing the huge and beautiful breast, being outside the couple, and death and mortality. And these 3 facts of life are lead us to modesty and not to arrogance.
This is in the aim of
and to depressive position, and of course, depressive position, and not a schizoparanoid position.
Mm-hmm. Hadar, if there's no more questions, I think
maybe we'll give one.
Okay.
Maybe if someone wants to say something also about Akhtar's lectures, and we can talk about it also. Ron, you want to say something? You enjoyed it?
Yes, it was very good lectures. I really I don't have anything much to say right now. I think I've referred to them a little bit in my papers.
משהו אחד אולי, one more thing. I thought how to relate to the lectures of Akhtar about goodness in your paper. And I thought that maybe to look for goodness in our patients is like an inner exercise to work with our hubris or pride. Pride not, but maybe our arrogance. I think it's a kind of inner exercise to try to see, to look for goodness in our patient.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
So if we don't have other questions, I'm very interesting to know where from the people come. So if someone wants to say, we have a friend from Greece. This we know.
We're in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Michigan.
I'm from Romania.
Romania, we are quite a few here.
Mm-hmm.
I spent a year in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Wonderful. When?
When I was 3 years old. My father had a sabbatical year there.
Where are you now, Ronnie? Where are you now?
In Tel Aviv.
In Tel Aviv, okay. Because I thought, gosh, wherever she picked up that English, there's a little American in it.
Canadian.
Okay, close enough. All right.
A little bit of Canadian accent.
Mm-hmm.
How did you heard about our conference in Romania?
From Gila.
From Gila.
And it was also forwarded by Hannah Ullman to the Relational International Association, YRPP. So we received the announcement.
But we also heard that one of you, I don't know if she's here.
And we shared it.
One of you is the translator of Akhtar's writings. I heard that.
I think Diana nodded, but I'm not sure.
I'm not the translator.
But he is translated.
Yes, it's translated, and I saw the name of the person doing the translations. But I'm not
there are 2 books, and one of the volume is coordinated by, it's 3 in total, 3 volumes of Salman Akhtar in Romanian.
Wow.
I'm the translator.
Where? We don't see you. Talk again.
Laura. Can you?
Laura.
Laura.
Hello.
Oh, yes.
Hi. Yeah.
I've seen the name.
Okay.
Yes, I've translated good stuff.
Congrats.
Thank you. In Romanian, I have it here. No, I don't. Sorry. So I've translated this one. This is his book on intimacy.
Yes,
edited
the
by
last
him.
one. Mm-hmm.
And good stuff was translated in Romanian, if I can give a verbatim translation, as the sources of suffering. The sources of joy.
It's the sources of joy. Both of them.
Joy, and we have another one, which is the sources of suffering, which in English was, just 1 second.
Exactly the same.
Yeah. But here they were edited as a collection, sources of joy and sources of suffering. And I translated another one, his edited book on fear, but this is in print right now. So it will be available in, I think, a couple of months.
Sometime. Mm-hmm.
Wow, bravo.
Mm-hmm.
It was a joy always translating Akhtar.
Yeah.
Okay. This session will finish in 5 minutes automatically. And at 8:30, it's 15 minutes from now, we'll have the 3rd plenary, which is a supervision of Akhtar on a meeting.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Ronnie.
Thank you, Ronnie. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hadar and Ronnie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
It was right.